Hello, Paola.
Bakargiev, director of the museum, the Castello di Rivoli Museum. So we are almost ready for the conversation. So just a few words about the exhibition we have here at the gallery. My name is Paola Potena. I'm partner of Lia Rumma Gallery. And I'm here now in Milan. You can see behind me maybe a little bit part of this exhibition, beautiful exhibition waiting for the Sibyl and Other Histories, which we opened recently at the gallery in Milan and which will be on until the end of September, maybe hopefully more. It's of course worth coming to see it closely now that things are gradually returning back to normal, because it's a beautiful exhibition. It's rich it's very intense. It's contamination of different cultures. It's really rich of food for thought for everybody. And in a way, this show, I mean, the title and the project that the exhibition develops on the 3 floors of the gallery space. And it's a kind of rib of a theater project that was premiered in Rome at the Opera House in September 2019. And it's fully dedicated and inspired by the mythological figure of the Sibyl. The Sibyl was an ancient prophetess who would predict the future of people by writing these oracles on oak leaves. And these destinies, I mean, were scattered around in the cave where she was living because of blowing the wind in this cave, and so that people would go and collect their destinies got the future and the destiny of someone else. So in a way, it's the impossibility to determine people's future through mathematical formula or through an algorithm. And the exhibition here, the Sibyl works are mainly drawings and a fantastic video, which is part of the theater project I told about. And then there is another floor. Part of this floor, or the second floor, is recalls a group of figures that are called riparazionisti. And these are exhibited in the courtyard of the OVR space in Torino. And it's a project that was curated by the Castello di Rivoli. And you will see these gigantic figures, silhouettes in steel that deals with the theme of work and the relation between men and work. And so part of the show is also dedicated to another Italian project by Kentridge. And then finally, there is another fantastic video installation, which is Kaboom. It's taken from the large theater piece, which is The Head and the Load. And it tells about 2 million, I guess, 2 million African porters and carriers that were used by German, French, and British troops during the First World War. So this is, it occupies an entire floor. So these topics and many others will be discussed by Carolyn and William. So I leave you the screen and the floor, so you can start the conversation, and then we will see at the end of the conversation.
Thank you, Paola.
Thank you.
So,
Carolyn.
Well, here we are.
Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Galleria Lia Rumma for inviting me. It's always an opportunity to speak with William. It's always a pleasure. And we've been doing it now for 30 years or so.
I think so.
Yeah, a long time. And hopefully without too many repetitions, or rather, hopefully with many repetitions, depends on the point of view. In any case, to prepare this talk with you, William, I went to Milano yesterday, or the day before yesterday. One of the first trips away from Torino since the so-called lockdown, and with a mingling of, you know, the fear of being on a train and wiping your nose after drinking some water, sitting on this train that was usually very full and now is rather empty, with people, business people going back and forth, but not exactly what it was. And anyway, the pleasure of going into the gallery was enormous, and the pleasure of seeing the new work that I hadn't seen, the Waiting for Sibyl, was enormous. And now, immediately it occurred to me that the piece was about our times. I mean, everything that you do is always somehow obliquely about our own times, but always remotely through something else that is often distanced geographically and historically. So to speak about the algorithmic society, I mean, this predictive society that is supposed to be our future heaven, and somehow to speak about what might be lost in that equation when the computer knows better than I do what I like or what I should listen to.
That is shocking when it knows more than we do about ourselves. When what we assume is our free choice suddenly has been predicted by the stupid algorithm. So yes, so there are things that it seems some ways to know us better, or you can program us better. But there's also such a sense of it being part of a controlling society. When the computer decisions are taken away from any human agency and given over to the computer, it's a joke when it's in a comedy show, but it's calamitous if your life is actually controlled by an algorithm you have no access to, and even the makers of it can't fully understand.
Of course, because it's self-learning. So of course the makers of it would not know. But do you really, really think that that is what's going to happen? Or humans are so capable of failure that we've probably programmed the algorithms wrong?
I'm sure we program the algorithms wrong to be accurate about who we are, but they don't have to be programmed right for them to be a real tool of authoritarian control, of societies and governments that want to know where we are, what we're doing. And it's not that they're always used that way, but it certainly feels, when one wants to believe in chance, in recognition, in associations, shouldn't be so clearly programmable. The algorithm does become a kind of enemy. And the problem is you can't really starve it, because everything that gives it its information is so useful for us, whether it's a phone call, whether it's this conversation now is giving so many pieces of data out that we willingly hand over our autonomy in that sense. It's not that they have to squeeze us to get information out of us. They're throwing it at it the whole time. So that was part of the way of the Sibyl story, was that what before would have been done with a prophetess or some other immaterial way of knowing the future has been taken over by computers. It used to be you'd watch the flight of birds in the sky to know what the weather was going to be the next day. Now the algorithm beats us every time at that. But yeah, that's the heart of the piece. That's not really the heart of the project.
Well, it's kind of the heart of our times, because not only were we already living in an algorithmic society, let's say the economy of attention, where anything that we look at produces data, which feeds this algorithm. But now we've just gone through, or we're still living through, a willful giving up of one's freedom of choice to, for example, kill oneself by being forced into lockdown. And I see these protests against it somehow from two directions. You have both a kind of extreme right. What do you call that man who was putting bombs in letters in America? That's it. You have a kind of extreme right Unabomber attitude against artificial intelligence. I mean, our times are what he predicted, and he went off into his log cabin sending bombs. And then you have also a kind of civil liberties left attitude towards what it lies behind the GDPR in Europe of protecting privacy. And both of these entities are somehow worried about what's going on during this coronavirus, the state of exception, what Agamben, called an incredible application of state of exception. He was greatly criticized some months ago, as if he didn't understand today, but by Jean-Luc Nancy and others. And now it's almost again a kind of a prophet. He was a bit of a prophet. But
I mean, there are all the questions of what the role of a state is. How much does it have to protect its citizens, and how much does it have to say citizens are adults and must take their own risks? And all around the world, there's been a kind of a mixture between that. But there's been this big belief that you need controls to protect more vulnerable people. In South Africa, we're at the stage where we have kind of the worst of both worlds. We had a very efficient, strict lockdown, and that has been relaxed. So everybody's back at work. There are a few cases where things are still locked down, but essentially there's no more lockdown. And this is happening just at the time when our infections are multiplying and growing exponentially.
It's very...
There's no good solution.
Yes, exactly. There's no good solution. That sounds like a sentence you would write in a piece, actually.
I think there are often circumstances where there is no, or if you try to push something into what is the determinedly good solution, it becomes such an authoritarian exercise to defend that position, rather than understanding there are less bad and there are various things and there are multiple approaches which one needs to hang on to.
Right. There's one drawing in the show in Milano that I've seen before, these words in your work. It's right here.
Let us try once not to be right. That's as with all the good lines that have been used in my text, they almost all come from someone else. That is a line from the Dadaist manifesto of Tristan Tzara. And it struck me as, I mean, if you think of the time of the First World War, everybody's certainty, all the politicians, their certainty had led to this complete calamity. If that's what was being right was, then let's for once try not to be right, and we may survive better. So I think it's something that strikes me very strongly, even though it was written as part of this absurdist manifesto.
Yes, but right now, everybody's trying to be right. I mean, there's a big problem. Coronavirus, algorithmic society.
Yes.
And then it's impossible not to evoke. I mean, people would wonder why we wouldn't be, or I wouldn't be. I don't know about you, but they would wonder why I don't evoke. So I evoke because I don't want people to wonder why I don't evoke. The other big hovering question of these days, is this, for me, is well, obviously it's the questions of the Black Lives Matter and the whole question of, in terms of, let's say, in terms of art, because I want to kind of bring it into the one small area where I feel I have a little bit, just a little bit of competence, not very much, but a little bit. And in that one small area, I would bring it towards this whole question of the statues that are being, horrible, sometimes very tasteless, and sometimes better quality statues that are being destroyed. So
just to give a sort of a perspective from South Africa, which is, or a perspective, not the perspective, a perspective on South Africa. The anti-apartheid struggle from the 1960s to the transformation in 1990 was, one could say, one long Black Lives Matter struggle. It was about the way that race had been turned into a question of power and people being dehumanized, and the struggle against that. it's not to say that those questions and questions of the residue of that don't exist in South Africa. They're still enormous. But putting that on the agenda was like saying, of course, that's been on the agenda. That has been the agenda, certainly in South Africa. In terms of what to do with historical monuments, that's also 5 years ago in South Africa, we had the Rhodes Must Fall movement, led by university students starting in Cape Town, but then throughout the country, which had to do specifically with a monument of colonialist Cecil John Rhodes at Cape Town University, getting that removed, and then larger questions of how does one deal with historical relics that are monuments to terrible times and terrible policies. So in a way, in many ways, I think South Africa leads the way in a lot of these questions that come to the fore in Europe and America later, but which are there. And I think that there, again, with the question of monuments, I would say that there is no good solution. There are many different possible solutions. It obviously doesn't work to say, well, all these colonial figures should be left in their symbolic place up on top of their plinths looking down on everyone. That doesn't make sense. It's just saying because they're there, they have to stay there, and that's enough of a justification. But it also doesn't work to say, well, let's take them all off and pretend that they don't
that they
exist.
never were there.
So for me, in a strange way, that boxing in of the Churchill statue, the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square in London. It's a very beautiful statue of sculpture. So and what happened was, to protect it, it's been boxed in with wood. So you had before a big bronze figure on top of a concrete plinth or a granite plinth. And now you have something that just looks like a huge wooden plinth. In other words, it's nothing on top. The sides go all the way up. And what that does is it makes everybody do two things. It makes them remember, what was the sculpture inside? What did that look like? And most people have got some memory of it. And then it also raises the question of, why has it been boxed in? And so what it does is it sets that sculpture and its historical question alive. And for people in Britain, he is the great hero who saved Britain and the West in the Second World War. For many people in India, he's the person who was responsible for the famine in Bengal that killed 3 million people, virtually half the Holocaust. And why on earth would you celebrate that? It's like having a sculpture of Goebbels for some people, to have that up there. And so these different positions, which would be deeply held by different groups of people, each of them kind of legitimately. He both did do extraordinary things in rallying Britain at that time, and he was responsible for the deaths of these huge numbers. And so it's, in a strange way, this indeterminate position of the sculpture, there but invisible, not visible, is one kind of solution that holds that in place. And I think one needs to find similar and different solutions to what one does with historical monuments.
Yes, actually, my memories of such events in recent times go back to after 1989 with, the Lenin sculptures going down in Lithuania and so forth. And also the second Iraq war, when the Saddam Hussein sculpture was taken down. So those are my earliest memories of such events in our times. But during Documenta, which you took part in 2012, and actually you were in the Kabul exhibition as well with Shadow Procession, one of the big questions was the destruction of cultural artifacts and the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which happened in March 2001, about 6 months before the Twin Towers. So I remember thinking, and I still think that this is true, but I don't know what it means now. I remember thinking that it was a sign of the importance of art, strangely enough, of a kind of return of power, a return of aura of the artwork, because there were many, many iconoclastic destructions of monuments and art ever since antiquity, since Mesopotamia, forever, until the French Revolution, kind of last great moments of destruction of artifacts, after which the market economy and the bourgeoisie, with its cynical attitude, detached the ideological power of artifacts or the religious power of the artifact from the monetary value of the artifact. So no matter, you conquered places or you changed the ideology of a place, but you didn't destroy the artworks, you would just remove it. And we know Hitler didn't actually destroy the Entartete Kunst. He put it away in storage. So it was as if the market value was more important than the fact that it was representing this or that or the other. So I somehow think that in the digital age, in the digital revolution, is with its dematerialization, is accompanied by a return of aura of the material embodied artifact. And for good and for bad, I mean, there's no, I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it's as if in the age of the symbolic, of the digital is the realm of the symbolic. I mean, I'm not talking to William in his kitchen. You have a sweater on and I'm in a hot terrata. Since we are in the level of the symbolic, then the destruction of the symbolic becomes more almost important. It has regained a kind of power and political agency that it didn't have before, for better and for worse. Because, I mean, this is a little touchy terrain, but there's a little bit of European or global North presumption in saying, I think I'm going to lose 90% of our watchers, but in saying that the Taliban were wrong to destroy all of the Buddhas in the archaeological museum and the Buddhas in the Bamiyan. Of course they were wrong from a certain, like what you are saying around the Churchill question. From our perspective of archaeological value of artifacts, of course they were wrong. But to say, as I read in the New York Times article of some days ago, that while it's fine and healthy and open and a sign of transformative powers of a society to rewrite its histories, the taking down the statues movement, and that's a kind of healthy development. On the other hand, the Taliban were destroying for the purpose of a violent future. Those were the words in the article. For the purpose of a violent future, destroying something from the past that represented a positive society. I mean, I have no idea what the society was in the Bamiyan Valley when the Buddhas were being carved, nor who were carving them, nor by what possible slave labor they were being carved. I have no idea. But whoever destroys a statue thinks they do it for some better good. I mean, and so all I would like to bring into this discussion is a little bit more skepticism and self-doubt, because it would be great occasionally to not be right. So, I mean, what do we do when we're right? You know, when we've, I mean, how long does that being right last? I mean, it's important. The struggle is important, but the struggle should be always a struggle, no? Even in one's art.
I mean, I suppose that is my belief is that you need to keep that historical question open rather than close it off by completely eviscerating any traces of it. And that space between still being bound and overwrought by the weight of history and pretending that history doesn't exist, one has to find some space where you can acknowledge it. And that means also acknowledging the different historical and symbolic forms of it, the different sculptures. In Moscow, they've got this rather astonishing garden of one of the museums, which they put all the old communist era sculptures of Lenin, Marx, Engels. But they're kind of astonishing because they're very much about the period in which they were made, as well as those particular figures. So there are maybe 20 different techniques of carving a Kalashnikov in granite, which you can see from the cubist to the naturalist to the constructive. And inevitably, monuments are always very much about the time in which they were made.
Yes, of course.
And we kind of know that monuments exist as an aid memoir. In other words, it's like a shopping list. You write everything down on your shopping list so that you don't have the responsibility of remembering it. The list remembers for you, and then you can take it to the shop. And in a way, the monument tells you that also. You don't actually have to remember the history. You look up and you see this figure and you know it's there. But what one has to do is always problematize and make the question of what is the history that one is looking at, because otherwise the danger is that you normalize it and assume that all these slaveholders and other people are our legitimate heroes. So I don't think the solution is either to blow it up like the Bamiyan Buddhas, nor is the solution to leave them as and one has to find a series. I wouldn't say one has to find a solution, one has to find many solutions that keep it in the air.
Probably case by case, also depending on the methodologies that are in each place. I mean, Canada, for example, I remember had worked very much on reorganizing the colonial collections in the museums, inside the museums with their labels. It's a very kind of Canadian approach, which I thought was so that, but let's imagine for a second, it's 100 years from now. And somehow there's this impulse to destroy, a public sculpture of yours or something of yours. What would that be? And what would it be caused by? What could be an imaginary situation where there's a rereading of our history in which you've done what you've done?
Well, I mean, that's not hard to imagine. There's one public sculpture of mine in Johannesburg, which is of a woman carrying a fire brazier on her head, and it's in fragments. It only is coherent from one particular viewpoint, and from all other points of view, it's very fragmented and abstract. So I could absolutely imagine people saying this is a kind of Western abstraction. It implies people have a sophistication of knowing the history of sculpture and of looking, but otherwise it has no connection to people walking past in the street. Let it go. At the moment, its main threat in Johannesburg is that it is made of steel, and there is a good market for scrap metal. So no bronze sculptures, public bronze sculptures in Johannesburg have survived. People have come with angle grinders and cut them away at night, and they've been sold to scrap metal dealers and melted down.
Yeah, well, most historical bronzes from Greece have been melted. Yes, melted.
I wouldn't
but
take
that's
it.
The story of your work, in a way. I mean, your skepticism, let's say, about certainties expresses itself in your own taking down, because erasing, you are constantly taking down your own images.
Provisionality, about saying, yes, this holds for this moment, but don't turn it into an eternal verity. Understand that it is a moment of a process.
But what about death in all of this? The piece that, what about death in all of this? I mean, we've been surrounded by a lot of talking about death, and in your piece that I saw, there's quite a lot about a good death, or not a good death, but somehow,
There's a line by a great, gosh, now of course it goes out of my head, a Finnish poet, I think, who says, start dying now, start dying wisely, optimistically, assiduously, which isn't to say start slitting your wrists now, but start understanding that this is part of who we are. And there's something I saw once which strikes me of, obviously as anyone is born, so their death is also growing inside them, in the sense of one's death like a tree. And as one's growing older, this tree is growing inside you. And a good death is one where this tree of death inside you has been enabled to flourish, to grow to a good size, rather than being cut off as a short sapling, as with a premature death. So that sense of, I don't know what it means, but of growing that death to its fullness seems to me where one needs to be, which is easy to say in abstract. I'm certain if confronted with it, one would be less poetic.
Well, it's partly because also our age. I mean, we've been doing conversations for 30 years. That means we're not exactly 30 years old. So,
45 now. Yes.
Well, whatever it is, it's also quite on the one hand, it's an epoch, you know, the epoch is thinking about the endness, you know, the Anthropocene, Adrian's work, crumbling sculptures. And so on the one hand, there's a kind of epoch, which is similar to the pre-Romantics,
right.
The last epoch in which sculptures were destroyed because they rather than thinking of selling them. And so there's, and on the other hand, there's also how our individuality is inscribed on this planet, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it is, it would be interesting to connect the question of breathing. I mean, the metaphor of breathing. I think when we spoke last, I was saying how the word, you know, the fact of breathing or not breathing seems to be the question of the coronavirus, people having the complication of the lungs and dying of.
Yeah, and then the death of the
or the masks, because you
yeah.
can't breathe very well. And then the death, the choking of Mr. Floyd, at the same time, you know, so many people choked in these hospitals or on the street, coronavirus, and then the breathing of, there was a third breathing that we were putting together. I can't breathe, the breathing of the, it's interesting. Oh, the breathing of the planet, the planet being in an ecological context where the planet can't breathe very much because the system of photosynthesis and the whole structure of refrigeration, of transformation of solar energy into biological life through this incredible system of breathing of the planet was having a hard time breathing. So I was asking you that I was saying that on a kind of associative symbolic level, these three areas were connected by this.
Absolutely, the sense of breathe, of what it is to take the outside world into you for that moment, and then to expel the outside world out of you as you breathe out.
The relation, it's a relation. It's like the interruption of this vulnerability. A sort of, you breathe in all sorts of things.
You do, but it's a sense of the, you know, there's a sense of the finite number of breaths each person has. You know, you're going to breathe 322 million times in your life, whatever it is. And if you knew in advance exactly how many breaths you'd have, then one would try to hold your breath the whole time, to expand that, to
keep it longer.
to keep them longer. It's always a question, I think, when you know, to get back to the local, to what it is to be making the art, to take these very large and very difficult questions and find a material in which you can actually think about them, through the activity of not thinking about them, you do think about them.
Yes, that's what you do. That's what the artist does.
That's the job of the artist. So to take the leaves of a book, the pages of a book, to be like the pages, the leaves of the tree of the Sibyl, which can multiply and grow and spin and turn. But without I mean, that's the job in the studio, learning the grammar of what you want to do and then playing with it. But without these other, sometimes ill-defined but very present questions and crises around us, there's no impulse in the studio to be to be working in the material. So it always needs this thing from outside the studio, and then it kind of forgotten inside the studio, but in the service ultimately of what's outside.
So I think a kind of breathing.
What you wrote in your very succinct definition of art is there to show that life is more important than art. In other words, there is a connection between what happens within the discourse of art itself, its conversation with art of previous parts, but also with things outside of the studio.
Well, I hope that we can have a conversation breathing the same air next time.
One of the things we haven't spoken about is friendship, which is one of the key things that holds it together. As you say, this is a conversation with, well, it's always not, it's never, It has a similar energy, but it's never the same conversation each time we talk. And it's always a pleasure. And
so what does that mean about friendship? What is this?
I think friendship's different thing are manifested in different ways. You live in Italy, I'm in South Africa. And so a lot of our meeting has to do with these kinds of things, which are about the life of the museum or the life of the studio and how these relate to things outside of the studio or the museum.
Yeah.
That's a pleasure. There are always new thoughts that you have whenever, often it takes me a year to understand, or 2 years or 4 years to understand something that you've said. The desire of the, you once said that the asteroid should get the vote.
Oh yeah, that was very important.
I'm close to understanding it. I'm not quite there yet, but I understand the direction of it, which I did not understand some years ago.
Yes, that had to do with de-anthropocentrization of society and culture, and yes, of course. But now I was just thinking about one thing, which is algorithms that, at least the ones that are being used now, they haven't really, or they're not being written to deal with friendship. I wonder what would be a world where the algorithm will tell me, I mean, there are of course algorithms, you know, dating situations that seem to work, but I wonder if this randomness of friendship, I mean, there's a certain layer.
I think that we are so vulnerable, and so our brains are so open to overtures of friendship and friendliness. I was once watching a virtual reality headset piece, which had within it a wireframe figure. It was a wireframe figure. There was no pretense at saying this is a real person that you're looking at in front of you. But there's one moment where she just turned and beckoned to whoever was watching to follow her. And my brain felt it as such a personal, direct invitation. I was kind of shocked. I thought, must I take my headset off now? How can I know everything else about this, and the affect is there as if it was real. So I'm skeptical about our strength to resist the algorithm.
Of course. No, there's no way to resist it. I mean, Mr. Lovelock, who wrote his latest book at the age of 100, which was just translated into Italian, it's the Novocene, the Novocene. He thinks, and he's the one who coined the term Gaia in the first place. So the origin of an idea of an interconnected system where asteroids could have the vote is, in a way, it's not in Isabel Stenger's Cosmopolitics or Bruno Latour, it's really in Lovelock before. Anyway, his new book, because he's like a young man, it speaks of our being the ancestors of entities which will be self-generating and self-healing machines. I mean, there will be no, he actually sees the Anthropocene as a transitional phase towards a new kind of species where there are no humans. Actually, there are no butterflies either. He might be wrong, but for sure, what does that have to do with what you just said? I don't know. I think we're getting tired. Maybe others who are listening are getting tired.
I think it's a good point. I'll tell you one thing that was very reassuring. They have an annual competition for robots. And the robots, and they give them a set of tasks. You have to climb a ladder, you have to climb down off the ladder, you have to open an ordinary door, you have to switch on a tap, you have to open a fridge. And even with all the best computing and best mechanical engineering in the world, of the 5 top robotic companies in the world, one of them was able to complete the task in just over an hour.
Oh.
3-year-old. So that was a relief to think, okay, the idea that one sees in Hollywood films of the Terminator or RoboCop, all of those things, are in a sense as far into the future as they were 30 years ago. And maybe in 10 years' time, I'd say, who was I kidding? How could I see that was not the case? But it is a kind of a disappointment and a reassurance.
Okay.
Good. Lovely to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you. What is the choreography here, Paula? Or
Paola?
Shopping.
Okay. Otherwise, we just say goodbye to everybody who's been watching, and thank you.
Hello.
Ah,
Can you hear me? Yeah.
voice.
Oh, I'm here.
Hello, dear.
Hello. Thank you. I don't know if you can see me, but I can see you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, William. And we try to keep your exhibition on hold like a breath until as long as possible. And waiting for you to come to Italy. Hoping you can come really soon. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.